Hello and welcome back to the Movie Memo Recaps. Today we are going to recap a 2014 movie titled Rage. Please be advised that there might be spoilers ahead. The film begins with Paul McGuire outside his daughter's school. He discovers that his daughter, Caitlin, has tattoos and scolds her mildly. She reassures him, explaining that the tattoos are part of a school project. Then Paul pulls Caitlin home and tells her to always try her best at school. Later, Paul gets together with his buddies Kane, a bar owner, and Danny. He's preparing a birthday party at Kane's pub and wants to make sure everything goes properly. He tells Kane not to offer alcohol to Caitlin and her friends, and he leaves feeling relieved when Kane agrees. Next, reporters question Paul, the owner of a construction company, and the town's mayor. They've been working on a proposal to create 100 new jobs, with earnings going toward medical research and education projects. That evening, Paul and his new wife, Vanessa, prepare for a large charity dinner. Meanwhile, Caitlin and her pals, Evan and Mike, remain at Paul's place. Paul knows Mike works as a dishwasher, so he offers him a summer position with his company. Paul, observing Mike's captivated gaze on Caitlin, engages in a private conversation with him, granting him permission to date her once he confirms Mike's lack of involvement with harmful substances. Paul and Vanessa remain out late, talking about business with another couple. At the same time, Caitlin and her friends watch a movie at home. The plot takes a drastic turn one evening. A police cruiser patrols the quiet streets, and Detective John, who is known for taking on difficult cases, approaches Paul. Given his past involvement in illicit activities, Paul is accustomed to encountering difficulties. This time, though, Detective John has a different goal. Instead of grilling Paul about his famed background, the investigator reveals concerning information about his daughter, Caitlin. This news strikes Paul like lightning, prompting him to rush home, only to discover Caitlin has vanished. Evan and Mike, her closest pals, recount a terrifying event in which masked men broke in and took her. Despite their heroic efforts to apprehend the kidnappers, they encountered armed resistance. Detective John proposes that Paul let the authorities handle it, telling him that they will do everything necessary to find Caitlin. Vanessa, in tears, asks Paul to do everything it takes to save Caitlin. The next day, media coverage of Caitlin's kidnapping dominates the airwaves, with the police pleading for public assistance in their search efforts. But Paul is obsessed with suspicion. The kidnapping could be a belated act of vengeance for his past actions, particularly his confrontation with Evan. Ignoring the police's advice, Paul chooses to conduct his own investigation. A flashback transports us back to his criminal background. He goes to Mike, hoping to learn important information about Caitlin's captors. A tense conversation develops, with Paul expecting Mike to have supported Caitlin. Mike shares her confusion over the incident and wishes he could have rescued her. In his search for clues, Paul approaches Kane and Danny, offering them money for assistance. But their commitment extends beyond financial incentives. They agree to help out of familial solidarity. Their research takes them to Oliver, a prominent underworld figure. A violent argument with Oliver's girlfriend escalates, but ultimately fails to reveal any information on Caitlin's whereabouts. Danny and Kane return to Paul with terrible news. Their efforts have gone nowhere. Paul's trust in the police shatters upon discovering Caitlin's death in a storm drain, leaving him devastated. Following Caitlin's funeral, O'Connell, an old acquaintance, provides advice. He argues that Paul, having left his mob past behind, should let the authorities handle the situation rather than relapsing to his former ways. Later, when Paul meets with Kane and Danny at his place, a flashback transports us to their criminal days. They once intercepted a Russian gangster on his way to a delivery and stole a large sum of money, as well as a Russian TT gun. This heist enabled Paul to escape crime, but it also sparked a bitter hatred between their Irish group and the Russian mob. Meanwhile, detectives discover Caitlin was murdered with a Russian TT handgun, the same type Paul had used in a mob killing. The detective urges his colleague to keep this information private. Paul returns to the school several times to collect Caitlin's possessions. Kane and Danny then uncover the use of the Russian TT pistol in Caitlin's murder. When Kane discusses this with Paul, he suspects connections to Chernov, the legendary mob leader they robbed 17 years ago. Vanessa initially supports Paul's quest for answers, but she becomes concerned that he will go back to his old aggressive ways. This raises a question. Perhaps Paul has always been a violent guy, unable to totally let his past go. Paul and his companions continue their search for answers. They confront Vori, a Russian gangster with whom they have had previous violent clashes. During a conflict, Vori attempts to flee, but Paul strikes him, causing his fatal injuries. One evening, the investigator speaks with Paul, warning him against future violent behavior and threatening arrest if he does not cease. Unconcerned, Paul subsequently joins Kane and Danny in a raid on a residence owned by Russian drug dealers linked to the mafia. They ruthlessly kill everyone inside. The next day, the detective and other policemen arrive at the crime scene. The detective immediately deduces that Paul and his companions are responsible for the massacre. Their activities have made them targets for Chernov, the Russian mobster whose men and operations they had recently interrupted. Soon, a climactic confrontation will occur. In the dimly illuminated walls of Kane's pub, a group of menacing Russian criminals arrives, their arrival marked by a blast of gunfire that disrupts the night's silence. Despite heroically defending himself in the ensuing chaos, Kane ultimately faces defeat, beating, and capture. Meanwhile, Paul, sensing trouble, rushes to the bar. He comes and sees the Russian thugs leaving, so he pursues them impulsively. A line of police cruisers immediately halts his high-speed pursuit. During this stalemate, the detective walks forward, harshly addressing Paul. In an unexpected change of events, the investigator offers Paul the opportunity to pull back from the brink. These events culminate in the arrest and torture of Kane. Chernov, wanting revenge, beat Kane mercilessly. Concurrently, Paul rushes to Danny's residence, delivering the terrible news of Kane's capture. In an agonizing moment, Kane approaches Chernov, assuming that Caitlin's death was retaliation for a crime they committed years before. To his surprise, Chernov admits that the Russian they killed back then was his brother. Amidst the turmoil, Paul begins to mistrust Danny. He wonders if Danny's previous acts caused Caitlin's death. This secret, known only by the three of them, eats away at Paul. Their original intention was to vanish with their stolen loot and live a low-profile existence. Overcome with rage, Paul forcefully breaks his friendship with Danny, unable to cope with what he has done. Meanwhile, Chernov plans a lethal rendezvous with O'Connell, revealing Paul's participation in reigniting an old gang war. O'Connell, tenacious until the end, meets a tragic fate, sparking a series of violent deeds. Paul's closet conceals a Tokarev gun, a silent reminder of their past crimes and the ensuing conflict. This weapon, chilly and menacing, reminds Paul of a past he tries to forget. One night, Evan sends Mike a cryptic message, inviting him to a covert encounter. However, a startling scene confronts Mike. Paul is hiding in the shadows, armed with a gun and lethal intentions. The air is thick with tension, and each second is filled with anticipation. As time passes, Mike's frantic appeals reveal the truth. Unexpectedly, a night of drinking and obsession with Paul's weaponry led to an unintentional shot that changed everything. In their desperation, they concocted a web of falsehoods, inventing the kidnapping story that tied them all. Paul makes an important decision while dealing with his emotional turmoil. He chooses to reject the temptation of his dark history and give Mike a chance at redemption. He walks away from their shared secrets with a sorrowful heart. Once home, Paul phones his wife and tells her about the start of his criminal career. Unaware that the ghosts of his past are actually at his door, he apologizes for his previous actions and assures her that the darkness will soon vanish. He tells her about his first killing incident, which occurred during a bar fight when someone handed him a knife. In a final act of desperation, Paul stabs himself as he sees the men approach the room with guns pointed at him. Vanessa arrives home to a heartbreaking scene. The cops are removing Paul's body from the house. Thank you for watching. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe for more recaps. Until next time, have a nice day.